Hello, I'm Melissa Swartz with Swartz Consulting. I'm here to walk you through how to avoid some of the common pitfalls in a UCaaS migration. Since 1991, I've been a vendor-agnostic consultant, guiding clients in selecting the right communication and collaboration tools and helping them get it implemented correctly. I'm here to share some of my experiences with you in hopes it helps you on your journey. So, here we go.
Avoiding common pitfalls in a UCaaS migration. I'm Melissa Swartz, and here's my contact information. If you have questions or if you'd like help with your project, get in touch with me. So, the first thing to think about when you're thinking about a UCaaS migration is, what are you trying to accomplish? You need to know the goals for the project. I know it sounds really basic, and here's why it's important. As you go through the project and you get crazier and crazier, and there's a lot of decisions to make, it helps to have the goals already established and prioritized. For example, you may have multiple goals. You may want to save money. You may want to have a better user experience. You may have financial considerations like moving to operational expense. What you need to do is take all of those and prioritize them. So later on, if you have to make a decision between a better user experience and saving money, you already know which is more important to you. And that way you can make that decision down the road. The next thing you need to do is think about your requirements, and you need to document them. So there's a lot of different requirements for a UCaaS project. You need to think about what kind of architecture is right for you, what features and capabilities you need. If you have a contact center, you need to think about those requirements. Do you have integrations? And how do you want to implement the solution? So there's a lot to think about there. In terms of architecture, the choices pretty much are public or private. You can also have a hybrid. In a public architecture, you're sharing, it's like an office building where you're just renting space in the office building. As a private solution, lets you build it how you want it to be, to customize it to your liking and your needs. However, private typically is more expensive. And of course, you could have a hybrid option. Another thing to think about is, how will you connect to the cloud solution? Do you want a private connection? Do you want it to be over the internet? How are you going to get there? And then with the solution, does the provider include the network services in your connection, or are they separate? If they include them, then sometimes they will take responsibility for troubleshooting over that problems that occur over the network. If you're providing the network connection, then that's on you. And are you looking to change to SIP at the same time? All of those things you need to think about in terms of your architecture and how you're going to proceed with the project. Next, you need to think about what features and capabilities you need. And for this, I highly recommend that you involve your business users and that you take the time to figure out really what they need and what problems they're facing, and if there's a way that the new technology can maybe make things easier for them. And also, you need to be able to distinguish between needs and wants. And the only way to really do that is to talk to your users and figure out what they need. And you can also do surveys. And I've found in projects where the clients have done surveys that they've actually gotten a surprising response rate. So that's another way to get input from your users without having to talk to everybody. So, you need to identify your key squeaky wheels and, important groups and talk to them, and then get input from everybody else, maybe through a survey. And then you really need to document what they're telling you so that you can make sure that you include that in the solution. Another important thing to think about is integrations that you may need. Do you have third-party programs that need to be integrated with your solution? Those sometimes are easy to integrate. If you are using Salesforce, for example, everybody has an integration to Salesforce. If you're using another CRM, you may or may not have an integration available. And this is something that a lot of people don't think about a lot, but I think it's important that even up front you include a communication plan and think about how often you want to communicate to your users, what you want to tell them when, and how you're going to let them know about the change. It's been my experience that organizations that communicate and maybe even over communicate with their users have an easier time when it comes to the change. The users are expecting it and they don't resist it nearly as much. So you really can't treat it like, well, we told you once when we're going to change. You have to treat it more like a campaign and continually provide information. And then the last thing to think about is how do you prepare for porting your numbers? We'll cover this a little more later, but if you're moving your numbers to the new service provider, there's a lot of stuff that you need to do in advance to make sure that you're ready for that, because that is a tricky and dysfunctional process. If you have a contact center, then you really need to look at those requirements if that's part of your migration. All of these areas are important things to think about. Reporting in particular is something that I find people don't look at very much in advance, and then they find out on the back end that the reports have changed and they're not getting the information that they need, and it creates a real problem for people. So definitely look at your reporting requirements, and then obviously, how you want your calls to route, what your agents and supervisors need to be able to do, and then if you've got recording storage capability with a cloud provider might be an issue. What about workforce management? Is this a integrated contact center solution, or is it something that is a third party? If it is third party, how do they connect to that third party? What kind of connections are there between the service providers? There's a lot to cover here. So these requirements are really important and can really bite you on the back end if you don't have them covered up front. And then there's your support requirements. What are you looking for in terms of support? How much training do you need, and what type of training? Do you want it to be on-site, or is web-based okay? Or do you want to train every user, or do you want to use a train-the-trainer model? And then how do you train remote users? So all of those considerations are important, and you need to think about that so that you can give those requirements to your prospective solution providers and make sure that they've included those costs when they get back to you with a proposal. And same thing on cutover support. Do you want any on-site cutover support, or is remote support okay? What about setting out the phones? Do you want to do that, or do you need somebody else to do it? Do you have time? So those are the kind of things you need to think about in terms of cutover support. And then in terms of support and administration ongoing, how much training do you want? How much do you want to do yourself? How much do you want the service provider to do? I have seen solutions where the service provider does your everyday kind of routine moves, adds, and changes for you. At no charge, is just included in the service. So is that something you want, or do you want to be able to control that and make sure that you have a ability to give your users this kind of the support intervals they're looking for? So all of those things are also part of your requirements and things that you need to convey to your potential providers. And then the big thing, how are you going to move from where you are to your UCaaS solution? Are you going to do it all at once? Is it going to be phased? How are you going to do it? If you do it all at once, then you don't have to really worry about connecting the new solution with your existing system. And that may or may not be a real challenge. I have a client today whose existing system is so unstable that their vendor told them, basically, you need to convert all at once, because if we change this system in order to connect to your new solution, it may create major problems and we won't be able to fix them. So you need to look at that. How hard is it going to be to connect to your existing system? How expensive is it going to be? If your existing system's at end of life, can you even add anything, the licenses that you need in order to have the connection? And do you have some sort of common protocol between the old and the new system so that they can connect? And then if you're looking at a phased migration, can your carrier stack the orders so that you can say, okay, we're going to do this week, and then next week we're going to do these things, and have those orders already prepared and ready to go on the carrier side. Otherwise, you may have delays because of the carrier. So all of that are things to think about. Now I want to move on to some technical considerations. First of all, you need to look at your existing infrastructure. Is it ready to support voice over IP? If you have a VoIP solution today, you know that answer. But if you don't, if you have digital phones today, then you need to make sure that your local area network is ready to support voice over IP. That means typically power over Ethernet switches, having quality of service set up, VLANs already configured for voice, and then you also need to look at your wide area network and make sure that if you are moving traffic from maybe a dedicated circuit to an existing data circuit, then you want to make sure that you've got the capacity in place and that the circuits are all installed where they need to be. So infrastructure is huge, and if it's not right, it really can cause problems down the road. So connectivity really is everything. If you lose your connection to your cloud provider, then you have no voice services. So part of your architecture may be to figure out how you're going to mitigate that. And then the stability of the connections is hugely important, and you need backup and maybe even tertiary backup. So you need to think about all of that. Dial plan is also important. Most people want to move their numbers to the new environment, so that means you're going to need to port those numbers. And you want to make sure that your dial plan will work in the new environment. Also, be aware that cloud implementations really move a lot of work to the customer side. By definition, the cloud is not at your site. So you are going to have to put together the user database, you're going to set out the phones, and you're going to do the testing unless you, as part of the proposal, move some of that work to the vendor side. So think about what you want in those areas. Also, be aware that you will probably need resources in areas that you didn't have to involve in your last project. For example, even in IT, you're going to have to involve your email team, your security team, your network team. You're going to have to involve, obviously, your telecom team. But you may have business units that are involved, and legal, HR even, your training resources. There are a lot of people that can be part of this project, and they may not have even been a consideration on the last part. So the team's going to get a little bigger. Now you should think about picking the solution, assuming that you have proposals in place. And we've kind of skipped over a lot of steps on what it takes to get a proposal, but you've documented your solution, you've got proposals, now it's time to pick a solution. And there are two things to think about in terms of that decision. First of all is the solution itself and the underlying provider. So, for example, you may be looking at, I don't know, a Microsoft solution, a Cisco solution, a Mitel solution, whatever it is. Typically, there's a partner involved. And you can buy a Ferrari, and it can be the best car in the world, but if the partner doesn't know how to drive it, you're not going to be going very fast. So the partner decision is a very important one, and it's a little bit tricky to try to figure out, who your best partner is going to be. So here's some things you can look at in terms of trying to distinguish between partners. How much market share do they have, experience in your industry? Have they done projects with others in your industry so they understand some of the important things to you? What's their coverage footprint look like, and does it match yours? Do they have expertise in the integrations that you may need to have? Definitely check references and dig into those. Are they financially stable? And then, do they have like one good engineer, or do they have, if that engineer goes on vacation or leaves the company or whatever, do they have somebody else that can come in and cover for them? So those are all things to think about as you make the decision. It's not just the solution itself, but the strength of the partner is hugely important in the success of your project. And then before you sign a contract, make sure that you know if you're moving your existing numbers that the numbers can port. Most of the time that's not an issue, but I have really run into times where for some reason the numbers can't be ported. So definitely make sure that they have run your list of numbers in their system and that they say they can port them. And then make sure that your underlying infrastructure of your network is ready. Here's some things to think about in terms of contract terms and conditions. First of all, did they get the cost structure right? Does the contract actually match the proposal in terms of the fees, any usage charges there might be, connectivity charges, what's up front, what's ongoing? Are you expecting, for example, your phones to be included in the monthly and the contract says they're up front? What are your implementation and setup fees? And then there can be, access charges and all kinds of surcharges and fees and taxes. So just make sure you understand the cost structure and that it matches what you saw in the proposal. Another important thing to be sure about is that you will own your own numbers. If they give you additional numbers, do you own those as well, and can you take them with you when you leave? And what's the cost for spare numbers that aren't necessarily assigned to a user? A lot of times we see costs for those numbers. And if you're doing a phased implementation, then when does the billing actually begin? If you have, I don't know, let's say you have 1,000 users and you're moving them 100 at a time. When does the billing begin? Do you bill for 100 and then another 100 and another 100 as they move? Or are you billed for the 1,000 the time you move the first 100? So make sure that all of that is straight in the contract and is the way you want it to be. Another thing to look at for in contracts is, in my experience, you can always add seats or licenses, but a lot of times there are restrictions on reducing them. There may be a clause that says you can reduce by, you commit to 1,000 and you can reduce by 10% or 20% or whatever, but if you go below that, you still have to pay for those licenses. So look at that and make sure that if you need it or you think you may have, either you're going to close some sites or there may be a business downturn clause, you need to look at what it's going to take to reduce the monthly billing and make sure that you can do that. And then another selling point that I see a lot is cloud providers will say, well, we're scalable. If you need to grow fast, we can add stuff, and you don't have to keep it forever. You can just have seasonal growth. Well, that's great, but look at the fine print there. Are there any sort of minimum that you need to meet? So if you can flex up and add 200 licenses and then you want to take them away, you got to make sure that you're not violating some sort of minimum contract requirement there. And then the other thing that we see a lot is if you do flex, how much billing is there for the flex period? So for example, if you flexed and you added 100 users for 2 weeks and the week happened to be 1 week at the end of a month and another week at the beginning of the next month, are you billed for the 2 weeks or are you billed for 2 months? So check into that and make sure you understand what's going on there. And then when it's time and you want to exit the contract, what happens? Make sure that you're not going to get hit with termination penalties. Is there an auto renewal clause? You need to make sure that you're aware of that if there is, or that you get it taken out. And then are there costs for taking numbers? So look at all of that and make sure you understand all of those implications. Service level agreements are important. And it's really hard to get a service level agreement that has any teeth in it at all. A lot of them have a lot of language and they're really long documents, and in the end, they don't do a lot for the customer. But look at what are the response times, and are those response times actually guaranteed, and are there financial penalties if they don't meet them, and are they actually hard metrics, or are they just goals? I see a lot of times where they say, our goal is to respond to major outage within X period, 99.9% of the time. Well, yeah, it's a goal. It doesn't mean anything happens if they don't do it. So look at that language, and then look at what's covered under the SLA. Does it cover to the edge of their network, and then once it hits the connection to you, there's no coverage on it, or do they go all the way up to your site? How far does that coverage go? What are the hours of coverage, and what's staff versus on call? It's going to make a difference in response time for sure if they're on call overnight or on holidays or whatever. And what are their monitoring capabilities? And then look at reporting. If you have an outage, what starts the clock? Is it started the minute the outage occurs, or does it not start counting as an outage until you actually report it, which is kind of what I typically see. So you could have been maybe down 2 hours overnight, you didn't know it, and then you get into work and you see and you report it. And that outage time will impact your penalties. So the amount of time that you're out is calculated as part of that penalty, and if you're not including all of the outage time, then you're not getting your full payment for the outage. And then look at, do they do automatic escalations where if a major outage hasn't been resolved within 2 hours, they automatically escalate it? Do they give you notification, or are you always chasing them to find out what's going on? Are there limitations on the penalties? I see that a lot where the maximum penalty is just whatever you pay them monthly. And then be aware that in most cases, 911 liability is all on you. They will not take any responsibility for 911. So let's talk about some common pitfalls and how you can avoid them. So first of all, termination penalties, talk back to that. Make sure on your existing contracts that you're also aware of termination penalties that may be there. When do your existing contracts expire? And what are your renewal terms? Do you have auto renewal things on them that you need to be aware of? And do you need to provide some sort of notification within 90 days before expiration that you're not going to renew? So look at all that and make sure that you're not hit with penalties even on your existing services. And then a lot of times what happens is you move your numbers from your old service. And some carriers are better than others about actually disconnecting those services when you move the numbers. So make sure that you actually have disconnect orders for the old services after you move your numbers away from them, and that you have the order numbers and everything documented so that if you need to go back and dispute that, you have the information you need. Another common penalty is that network infrastructure is not ready for VoIP. And it's not only just an implementation issue, it can be a problem just with ongoing call quality. So doing a thorough network readiness assessment up front is important, and it's worth the time to do up front. If you're making changes to your network and adding new legs or new services, those can cause delays. We see a lot of really long intervals in terms of adding new services. So make sure that your project plan accommodates that and that you build in some extra time. It just happens way too often, so be aware. And then when it comes to actually documenting how your users need to be configured, you need to make sure that you have the resources, if you're doing this yourself, and make sure that you involve your users so you get the phones configured correctly. Another common pitfall is that putting out the phones takes a lot longer than you think. We sort of, as a rule of thumb, plan on about 30 minutes a phone. So you have to basically unbox the phone, take it out of the box, put the phone together, get it to the user's desk, unplug the cable at the back of their computer, plug that into the phone, add a new cable between the computer and the phone, and then make sure it all works. And sometimes, depending on how the cubicle's set up or the office, they have the phone on one side and the computer on the other. You may not have a long enough cable. Sometimes cables are under the furniture. It takes way longer than you think. And I did leave out a step. You need to actually update the firmware on the phone once you get it configured. So it takes a while. It takes longer than you would think. Contact center integrations. Oh my goodness. There's lots of gotchas on the contact center side. So you really need to be careful about defining your requirement. See actual live demos of somebody that's as close to your situation as possible and talk to references and try to figure out where the gotchas may be on it. Number porting, moving your numbers to the new carrier. Things that you can do to prevent problems as much as possible are to get an inventory early from your existing carrier, a customer service record, and check it and make sure that all of your numbers are on it, that the records are correct. A lot of times the records are wrong. And if you need to get a correction made to the record, it takes a while. So check all that and make sure that all of that's ready in advance. It will make the whole process later much easier. And get copies of the bills if you don't have them so that you can look at all that and confirm everything. And confirm, for example, just the name on the bill. If you submit an order and the name's wrong, even I've seen them where somebody had a period instead of a comma and the order was rejected. So this is a really crazy process. And as much work as you can do up front to get your documentation together will save you time in the end. Be aware that fax and analog can be issues. And think about, on the fax side, can you replace existing faxes with a fax server or some sort of cloud fax service? And if not, can you at least make sure that all of your fax devices are T38 compatible? On the analog side, you're going to have edge devices or some sort of analog converter, unless there's a way that you can convert some of those stations to IP. So analog can be a real hairball as well. So make sure that you've got all of that figured out. And then we already talked about connectivity between the old and the new solutions for a phased conversion. So you've got to find something that the two systems have in common. How do you connect them so that they can talk to each other? And definitely hound the provider and make sure that they have actually done a connection with your type of system before. Otherwise, it can get to be really tricky. So if they've done it before, that makes it a lot easier. So now that you're ready to go, let's think about testing. You need to have a test plan, and it really needs to be written out. A lot of times vendors provide test plans, and in my experience, they are just not very complete. They may test kind of basic in and out. Do you have dial tone? can you call the main number kind of thing. But you really need to make sure that you have a very complete test plan. Make sure that you've got unit testing done and integration testing is completed. And if possible, run some sort of pilot group or proof of concept and make sure everything's working and you understand how it all works before you roll it out to everybody. Here's some things that you definitely need to be sure that you test. So your call routing, test all of your customer-facing numbers. And not only in day mode, but what happens at night and in holiday mode, make sure all of that works correctly. Your auto attendant works correctly. Your voicemail and your voicemails into your email all work. Do you have a mobile application? Does that work correctly? Does your conferencing and collaboration tools work like you think? And then contact center, you just cannot be too thorough in that. Test all your call flows and then look at your recording. Is that working? Or are reports working like they should? Are the integrations all working? There's a lot to test there. And once your testing's complete, now you're ready to make the transition. So how are you going to train your users? What kind of online resources are you going to provide for them? Make sure that you've got the time scheduled, especially rooms, training rooms, scheduled in advance if you're going to do classroom training. Look at the curriculum provided by the vendor and customize it. You may want to take stuff out that you don't want your users to even, you know they're never going to use it, so don't even train on it. Or maybe there's stuff you don't want them to know about. How are you going to handle your remote users? Think about all of that and make sure you get that ready so when it's time to go, you can just roll it. And ramp up your communication with your users and make sure they know what to expect and what's going to happen to them. And it's all about them, so make sure that they know in their individual situation what to expect. And then what kind of support do you want actually for day one, for the cutover itself, and then day one, and get all that in place and tell your users what to expect and where to report problems. I like this next one, especially on the first phase or at the cutover. Your project team's going to be involved with you, but don't tell them it's okay for them to move on until you've actually made a test call for support and make sure that the support, that you can reach support and get support and it does what you need it to do. So don't let your project team go until you can make sure the support side of it works. And then what kind of ongoing support and admin training are you going to need to make sure that things are working well? So to wrap it up, reconcile your contract before you accept the solution. Did you get everything you were planning to get? In the heat of the battle, it's easy to overlook things, so just make sure that you did get everything you thought you were supposed to get. Place the disconnect orders for all the old stuff. Review your new bills and make sure that the counts are right and that the billing is at the rate you're expecting. And then also don't forget your old bills. Make sure that if you did disconnect services that they have come off the bills and are no longer billing. And that gets you through a lot of the pitfalls in a UCaaS migration. If you've got questions, if you'd like help with your project, here's my contact information. Thank you.